Just quick, I'm going to go through just real quick with the agenda here in terms of what I'm dealing with. We'll go through a little bit on the plan highlights, what you can do, what you can't do, how you can get in, that type of thing. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on where we are now, what's gone on, obviously, between COVID-19, the quarantine, and that type of thing, and then where we see things headed as we go into 2021. Talk about the investment options, what's inside the plan, what's available to you, how do you enroll, and then a little bit about planning to go along with this. Okay, so a couple of things. I'll leave Q&A until the end. So certainly if you do have questions, you can bring it up at that time. But you're always available, and our contact info will be available to reach out afterwards if you've got questions. It's just when I'm doing it this way, it's hard for me to see in the chat box. So if you want to wait till the end, or if you want to shoot a question in the chat box, I'll try to get it at the end of it, and then I'll take it from there. All right, so plan highlights. So eligibility, everybody is immediately eligible to enroll in the plan upon your hire. There is no waiting period. That should be in the update that Jennifer sent out today. You can contribute anywhere from 1% to 100% of pay. There's a little asterisk there. I will touch on that in a second of what that actually means. Rollovers are accepted into the plan. Distributions occur on death, disability, or separation of service. There is a hardship provision that is for a first-time home buyer, education, or major medical expenses. That's the only reason you can take a hardship. But in order to take a hardship, you would actually have to take a loan first, because a loan is a much more efficient way to take money out. You have the ability to take a loan from the plan, and there are no employer contributions, matching, profit share, anything like that allowed as far as the plan is set up. It can only be your salary deferrals. So I told you that you could contribute anywhere from 1 to 100% of pay. Well, that's to a limit. The IRS guidelines for this year and for next year are $19,500. So if you follow me, if you earned $19,500, you could put all of it into the plan if you so choose. I don't know what you're going to live on, but you could put all of it into the plan if you wanted to. Now, there is what I call the Hines 57 rule. You'll have to forgive me for that, but it is the catch-up provision that says if you are turning 50 or over 50 years of age, you can put an additional $6,500 into the plan for a total of $26,000. These numbers are the same from 2020 to 2021. They did not change. There were no updates. Because of the pandemic, I think they just held everything where it was. We did get an increase from 2019 to 2020, which was a good thing, but they kept everything where it was at for 2021, okay? All right, so COVID-19, the quarantine, and where do we go from here, essentially? What happened this year? And I'm going to go through some of this in terms of a grander scheme, and I don't want to get too deep in terms of the history of what happened and what's gone on, but I think it's important to get sort of a clarity or a somewhat of an understanding if you're already participating or going to be participating in any type of a financial enterprise, that you get a little sense of where the markets have been and what's happening with them. So we'll talk about where do we go from here, and then mainly what should you do or what should you be concerned with. So when we look at the broad picture of the markets themselves, now these are the major indices. So you have the S&P 500 index, just for those in the audience. That just means the 500 largest companies, stocks in the domestic US marketplace. That shows you year-to-date, 1 year, 3 year, and 5 year returns. 6 months ago, a lot of those numbers were red. Now they're all black. We'll talk about that in a second. The DJIA, that's the Dow Jones Industrial Average. The Dow is just a basket of 30 stocks that is a greater representation of the entire market unto itself. The Russell 2000 is just a broader expanse of the S&P 500. It gets into smaller companies than those that are composed of the S&P 500. the Morgan Stanley Asia, Europe, Far East and Australia, otherwise known as the MIFI, the Morgan Stanley World Index. That's every other country except for the US and Canada, essentially. And then you have the US Aggregate Bond Index. That's just this, all of the bonds, and bonds are, stocks are investment in a company, ownership of a company. Bond is a debt instrument. You've lent money to a company. And that's just the entire US bond market across a grid. Everything is black right now. Everything is up because we have bounced incredibly. And that's what we're going to talk about in a second here with what's gone on and what's happened with the marketplace. But, you know, really for a plan participant, what you should be concerned with isn't so much the greater what's going on in the world, but really more about what you can control and what's you're able to do. Now, this is a quote from the former federal, well, still federal chairman for now, Jerome Powell. We don't try to control things we don't control. We try to control the controllable. We're just trying to do our jobs. I put this in for two reasons. One, I feel like if he had, the next line had said, we're on to Cincinnati, this might as well have been Bill Belichick at the podium. But two, had this, the question he was asked was about the president. He was asked specifically at that time, which was a year ago almost to the, you know, it was October of last year, about President Donald Trump. And this was his response. He was not having anything to do with the president at that time. And they were not, literally, they couldn't even speak his name at the Federal Reserve Bank, is how bad things had gotten between the White House and the Federal Reserve Bank. Don't worry about what's happening in the greater scam. Try to control what you can control. And part of that is not getting caught up in the emotions of the market. All markets cycle the same way. We start out in optimism. Hey, I think things are starting to look good. We buy in euphoria. Hey, everything is great. I'm going to keep buying. We hold out in fear, and then we sell in depression as the roller coaster ride goes. And for a 401k or retirement plan, in your case, 403b plan participant, it really is the only way you're going to get hurt in all of this, just like in a roller coaster, is trying to jump off mid-ride. When you're on or buying in a retirement plan, you're buying on the way up and you're buying on the way down. When I say worry about what you can control, pick the mix that fits for you, how much risk you want to take, and stick with it. Don't try to get in and get out or think about what's happening or what's going on, and we'll talk about that in a second, right? Control what you can control. All right, so how did we get here? And this is the history lesson. I'm not going to go too deep into this because honestly, I could spend a couple hours on it. But essentially, if you go back to the post.com bust at the turn of the century that went into 9/11, from there, the then chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, Alan Greenspan, pretty much let the banks and mortgages go unchecked, right? That led to the housing collapse, the housing bubble, in which case you got the then Federal Reserve Chairman, Ben Bernanke, coming in, and he started this thing called quantitative easing. I don't want to go into the details of what quantitative easing was really about, but just if you just substituted the words stimulus check for quantitative easing, you sort of get where we are today, because it's the same concept, is the fact that money, interest, was non-existent. And the Fed was telling you as far back as 2011 that the only place that your money was going to get any type of interest or any type of gains was going to be in the stock market. And that's what went on and really drove this thing up forever. And honestly, it's still going on today. As these markets, as money keeps pouring into the markets, things that normally would have caused us to have downturns and corrections and reversals in the market, this market has just shrugged it off. Oh, China devalued their currency? No big deal. Trump is throwing tariffs at every country in the world? No big deal. It took a global shutdown, a pandemic, to actually get the market to drop into bear territory, which is a drop of more than 20%. That's not supposed, it's just crazy. And we, even from that, we bounced out of it. Now I'll talk about that in a second. I mean, that's what's going on. But so where are we headed, right? So what we had happen was the V. The market went down February 9th. February 19th was the high of the market at that time. And we dropped to the bottom in March, 30% decline. By August, we were back up. Looked like a V. But that's so fast, it's not supposed to happen like that. Sometimes when a market collapses, they look like a U, right? We'll troll along on the bottom for a little while and then come back up. Didn't happen here. We went down and came back up. But the question is, where are we headed? Where are we going with this? And that's where we start looking at, whether the next time we downturn, depending on where we're at with the pandemic, is this going to look like an L? Like we go down, we come back up a little bit and then go sideways? Or is this more like a W, right? We went down, we came back up, we're going to go back down, and eventually we'll come back up. I'm not really sure what's happening with this. I just know in the foreseeable future, we're going to have some kind of a correction occur. My belief is if another one occurs, it's going to look more like a square root or a reverse square root technically than anything else. And you sort of saw that early on back in like May with this current downturn where we went down, we came up, and then we sort of slid sideways a little bit. Looks sort of like that back in May. And that's really, a concern as we go forward. But again, I'll talk about, for being in a retirement plan, making sure that you're staying in because you're going to buy as all of this occurs. And when we look at investing, you're never going to look at toilet paper the same way again, right? So this, toilet paper is sort of what I use as the FOMO, the fear of missing out analogy to investing with the markets and what's going on in the pandemic, because you weren't thinking about toilet paper. You probably weren't even the person who triggered the thought in your head. What happened is probably somebody went to a store and came back and said to you, hey, by the way, weirdest thing, I went to the store and there was no toilet paper. Then you went to the store and suddenly you saw there was a whole aisle, there was no toilet paper. And now you start to think, well, hey, wait a minute, maybe I need some toilet paper. And then it was, now I got to find some toilet paper. Hey, I got to have toilet paper. And that's what went on. And that's sort of what happened with the markets. And the markets do that and do happen. And what you get and what happened in this, as the pandemic was going on, is you had swings that were occurring that just made no sense at all. They were just moving, 3, 4, 5% at a time. And it's not supposed to do that. 1% is considered volatile. We were ping-ponging back and forth in April and May like it was going out of style. And that's not supposed to happen with the markets, right? So the thing to think about here with this, and why I keep coming back to, hey, control what you can control, is this is talking about dollar cost averaging. And dollar cost averaging just means that as your money's going in, if you are investing, if you're in the retirement plan, you're buying as the market goes up, you're buying as the market comes down. You're not trying to pick and choose and find one place or one spot to say, hey, now I'm going to invest today, because who knows what's going on. The fundamental and best thing to do is to buy as it goes along. This talks about, hey, if it was $10 a share, you'll put $100 in, you got 10 shares. If in February it went up, it's $14 a share, guess what? You only bought 7 shares. And then if it went down in March, which is what happened with the market, to $8 a share, well, guess what? You bought 12. When I average it out, it ends up being that it only cost me a little bit more than $10 a share out over those 3 months because I was buying as it was happening. So what does this mean to you as far as getting in if you're not already participating, or even if you are? And Jen, you don't have to chime in because one question I didn't ask was when the payroll is. I did it based off 26, so every other week for payroll. If it's 52, the math still works. You can just sort of times it out from there. But just the example I'm using is based off bi-monthly or 26 pay periods in a year. So if you got a $26,000 salary and I want to contribute 5%. That means I'm going to put 1,300 in, or, excuse me, for what is $50 per paycheck. So 26,000 divided by 26 means my gross pay before taxes or anything else is $1,000. My net take home, state of Massachusetts now is what I'm using, is roughly about 839. I'm using a rounded 11% tax bracket for the Fed and 5.1 for the state of Mass. It's probably a little less on the Fed, just depending, but just go with me on that. 16.1% or 839 before any other deductions, healthcare, FICA, any of that stuff, just federal taxes that we're dealing with. If at that point I took my $50 and put it into the plan, I would have 789. But that's not how this works. For anyone who's not been in a plan before, that $50 that you put in comes out pre-tax. So instead of $1,000 getting taxed, it's actually $950 that's getting taxed. And at that same tax rate, that $950 actually equals $797 out of pocket, not $789, which means that in a sense, it cost you $41.95 to get $50 into your plan. You're still out of pocket $41.95, but you got $50 into your retirement plan. And that's on a 26-week time period. If you do it out, you've got more than $250 in tax savings by participating in the retirement plan. And you may say, Tom, well, you know what, that's great, but you know, $1,300, I don't know that I can afford to put $1,300 into the retirement plan. I said, okay, let's look at spending needs versus spending wants, okay? And spending needs really are those essentials that you have to cover, everything you have to pay for that you need. You know, it's rent or the mortgage, it's insurance, it's car, that everything. Wants are those other things that, you know, we found through the pandemic, and I'll talk about this in a couple of slides, that maybe we could do without and still get along. In this case, I'm talking about lattes, coffee. This is a $3 coffee. If I did $3 on coffee, and we're not talking the real good stuff, granted, it's not Cumbies, but it's probably Dunkin' Donuts is what, you know, we're talking about here. But $3 for coffee, if I did that every week, that's $21 a week, right? If I did that for a whole year, that's almost $1,100 just in coffee. That $1,300 suddenly isn't that far off from, gee, what I'm spending on coffee on a daily basis. And that's one of the ways to be thinking about what am I spending and what could I be spending it on? All right, so how do you enroll in the plan? So there's a whole kit that gets created that we can get to you. You know, Jen will connect you to us. I've got our contact information from there. But really what the kit is involved is, it's an enrollment form. The enrollment form just asks you for your information. There are the investments in there. And Kevin, I know you asked me some questions in an email just before I came on here. I don't have all of the answers. I can get them to you, but we can certainly at the end of this, if you want to just sort of go through them, I can go in and out with a couple of them. But there's about 40 choices in the lineup for funds that are inside there. And as Jen said, part of this is not only do you have to sign it, but then either myself or the other plan advisor, Craig Richardson, one of us has to sign off to send this in to get you enrolled. The additional forms that go along with this are beneficiary. A retirement plan, IRA, qualified account, qualified just means pre-tax. They pass by beneficiary designation. It means you name somebody, if something happens to you, who's going to get the funds. This is very important. It's something that we bring up all the time. In fact, doing a whole presentation on, there's a whole separate webinar on beneficiary reviews and estate planning and why it's important, especially, you know, in the community that you guys deal with in a special needs world. What happens with unforeseen, you know, good intentions and unforeseen consequences of a family member leaving something to a child with special needs that immediately then disqualifies them from any benefits. So you want to take your time with it. I will tell you, if you're married You can name anybody you want. If you're married, you have to name your spouse, though you don't have to. You just have to let your spouse know that you're naming somebody else and they have to sign off and approve it. So good luck with that conversation. But you can name anybody you want as your beneficiary. And then the only other form that's necessary is the salary deferral agreement. And that salary deferral just is where you say how much you would want to contribute on a weekly basis into the plan. We recommend doing a percentage instead of a dollar amount. A percentage will always increase as your pay increases. A dollar amount stays static. You have to, as you get a pay increase, remember to go back in and change it to flow with that increase. The salary deferral agreement does not go to MassMutual. That goes to Jen and to Michelle or Michelle, and they handle it because it stays with the Center of Hope in your file. MassMutual doesn't need to see it. They'll just let them know that you're going to be contributing and how much that's going to be. So the investment choices, as I said, there's about 40 of them in here. One of the things we will do is sit down with you if you're getting ready or want to, whether you're already participating or thinking about getting in, we'll go through what you've already done, or if you're looking to join, talk to you about what might be a mix that might fit for you based on age, time horizon, and what you're trying to accomplish. Just understand in the beginning, if you're not participating yet, there's nothing in the plan. You're not risking anything. Okay to be a little bit more risky when you have little assets in there and then change it as you go along. You can make changes to your lineup. That's something that you have the ability to do. But essentially inside there, you know, there's funds from all sorts of different companies. AF is American Funds. Since it's MassMutual, a lot of these are specific to the MassMutual domain of fund companies that are available to them. But you do have Eaton Vance and Calvert and Lord Abbett. These are all highly rated companies, Invesco, BlackRock, etc. So they've got them broken down. Just to break it out for you, when you look at equities, equities come in 3 different slices: large cap, mid cap, small cap. Large cap just means any company with more than 7 billion, and that's a B, of capitalization. A mid cap is anywhere from 2 to 7, and a small cap are companies with less than $1 billion. So when I said to you before, when I was giving you the indices and what the S&P 500, pretty much the S&P 500 is made up of all large cap companies. All of those 500 companies have more than $7 billion in capitalization. That's what puts them in the S&P 500. And then we do have some specialty. So there is a real estate, that's a REIT, real estate fund. The IV Natural Resources is a commodities fund, right? That's tracking the water and electric and oil and those type of things as part of their fund. The fund. I was okay on dealing with all of that. The main investment theme for the fund. And then you have international. International, a little bit different. International has both world, that includes the US, and purely international, which usually excludes the US. You do have some that get very specific, that American Funds Euro-Pacific Growth, obviously just Europe and Asia for that. But you have like the World Growth and Income and Templeton World, which will include the Americas along with the rest of the world. All right, so every decision that you make is a retirement decision. This goes back to the lattes, right? So one of the things that comes up a lot with participants, and you have to forgive me, but my analogy there is a savings train that never gets into the station. Because we have conversations and it's, well, I'm just getting out of school. I want to pay off my student debt, then I'll participate. And then it's, well, you know what? I'm going to get married. I want to save for a house or save for the wedding. Then I'll participate. We're having a baby. We want to put some money aside for the baby before, then I'll participate. Then there's education fund. And the next thing you know, you're 45 or 50 years old and you haven't done any savings yet into the retirement plan because you were waiting for it to happen. the best piece of advice I can give to anybody is to start now. The one thing you can never get back is time. Time is something that you can never get back. So it's always take advantage, start contributing, even if it's only 1 or 2%, but at least you're starting and getting something in. The Mind the Gap is a fun thing for me because if you've ever been on the tube in London, every time they pull into a station, the little speaker says, mind the gap. Well, that's not what we're talking about, but we're trying to keep the train analogy going. The Mind the Gap is Social Security is only going to pay you a small percentage of what you need for income in retirement. That gap between what Social Security is going to pay and what you need to live on, that's you. You've got to fund the rest. And that's the gap that you've got to mind and be thinking about, and why not spending $3 on a latte today will help you if you can put it towards retirement for tomorrow. That's just the thought that goes along with that. All right, savings versus spending. This is the really, it was pandemic funding in terms of talking about this. The analogy is, though, what you were spending either last year or even the first 2 months of this year. If you go back and look at what you were spending, even as close as January and February of 2020, to what you ended up spending in, say, April and May of 2020, it's going to be radically different because you were suddenly cut off from a lot of things that you were spending money on. Dining out, games, theater, movies, that type of thing. And the real lesson from that is to try to say, can you take some of that budgeting that you've done, that you've been in, and move forward with it so that, okay, we want to go out and eat, we want to help local restaurants, but maybe not as frequently as we were. Maybe I'm not stopping at the coffee shop. Now maybe I'm making coffee and that's what I'm drinking for my coffee, for my caffeine addiction that I've got to deal with. Those type of things are things, can you bring that forward so that you're not worrying about, gee, I can't get into this plan because I don't have any money, when it's more of I've made changes and adapted. Now, I will say one thing to that, I will apologize in front with this. My analogy, my visual for everything is buckets. I'm a bucket guy. Some people like bags, some people like pools. For me, it's buckets. I always use buckets as my analogy. So it's talking about buckets and thinking of where your money's going and what you're trying to do with it in terms of 3 different buckets. Your first bucket is sort of that short term, what I call emergency reserves. Now, planners have said forever that you should have anywhere from 3 to 6 or 6 to 9 months of expenses in the bank. Well, that sort of went out the window with the whole pandemic thing. What Craig and I tell everybody is right now, specifically today, what your goal should be is to have somewhere between, let's call it 8 to 10 weeks of expenses in the bank right now. If you do not have 8 to 10 weeks worth of expenses that cover all of your needs that you have in the bank, that should be the first thing you're focusing on. You should be offsetting or cutting down on whatever you're doing as far as your other savings to make sure that first bucket gets filled first. You want that bucket to have that 8 to 10 weeks, emergency reserves, cash in the bank, because you're going to be better off if we go into another quarantine. Baker, the administration just scrolled back to reopening phase 3, round 1 or whatever. So who knows what's going to come, but that should be your first focus. After that, then you can start worrying about the other buckets, bucket 2 and bucket 3. Bucket 2 is more of, I'm saving for that home, education for the kids, that sort of mid-time planning. And bucket 3 is retirement. We're not saying give up the retirement bucket. We're saying maybe cut down on it so that you fill bucket 1 first. Once bucket 1 gets filled, then you switch the money and start pouring it into bucket 2 or bucket 3. But if you're not filling bucket 1, inevitably what's going to happen is you're going to get yourself in trouble, and that usually means debt. And debt will crush any of this and certainly take away from any opportunity to participate in the plan. And the only way that ever happens is if you're doing a budget and sticking to it and planning. if you don't have a budget, if you don't know what you're spending, I don't know how you can save. Because if you don't have an idea of what you have got coming in, then and what you've got going out, how are you planning to save in any way, shape, or form? And so one of the things to be thinking about, especially as we go here to the end of the year, the holidays, everything sort of winds down a little bit in that time between Christmas and the New Year. You got resolution planning that comes up for the New Year's and looking at goals for 2021. Well, one of those goals should be, can I put myself on a budget if I don't have one? If I have one, can I look at it and make sure that I'm sticking to it? And can I figure out how I'm going to fill those three buckets as I go forward in 2021? Now, one of the things that we offer to everybody is an opportunity to sit down with us, and we'll help you do that. There's no cost to you. You're an employee, whether you're a plan participant or not. Our goal is try to help everybody have a better relationship with their money, and how we do that is through a planning process. We'll help you figure it out. That's why we're here. That's what we want to do. We want to make sure that we're helping you and get you, if it's trying to get you back on track, if it's trying to help you, so pay down debt so then you can start to save, whatever the case may be. But we make that offer to everybody, and don't think, hey, it's today that I got to take advantage of it. It's anytime. If we get into the new year and you start looking at resolution planning, feel free to reach out. We're happy to schedule a time and talk to you and see if there's something we can do to help. That's why we're here. That's what we're trying to do. This is us. That's me. Craig isn't here. He's had the week off, so he's off hunting someplace, I think. I don't know where. Somewhere in New York, I believe. He's hunting at some camp or something. But that's our contact information. For me, it's 617-682-7374. It's talessi@moodystreet.com. Jen has this information as well. I know in the invite that gets sent out, not only did it have the link here, but it also had a link to our virtual scheduler. So if you ever want to have, a opportunity to talk one-on-one and go through things, we can set up a Zoom meeting and do that and answer questions that way. That's really what it's about, trying to help you out with it. That was pretty much everything that I had. So, I'm going to open it up if you guys want, if you got questions. Like I said, I don't know if anything came in the chat because I can never see the chat box basically when I do the presentations this way. But if anybody has any questions, feel free, ask them.
Now, what do you think roughly would be the turnaround time, Tom, if somebody got in touch with you for it to then come back to myself or Michelle to be able to start somebody in a 403B plan?
So let me ask you, because I didn't ask you beforehand, the payroll, is payroll weekly or biweekly?
Bi-weekly.
Bi-weekly. So let's say we had the conversation, next week, you're probably looking at the middle of January, right? So figure a month, because you never know with processing what's going to happen. You got to send it in. Mass Mutual's got to get it set up and then links it to you and go through. So figure, you could get it in the next payroll run type of thing, but it's easier to say, figure it'll be the second payroll run out.
Okay, yeah, because it would also fall to when our payroll ends, so you and I would coordinate that, or
Right.
with Michelle of the day that it would. Okay, so it's actually a fairly quick turnaround time.
Oh yeah, it can be done fairly quickly. Like I said, usually it's, and the paperwork can be done. So in this process, because we can send it out to you and literally be filling it out with you, where then we can email it, you can sign it and scan it back to us or fax it back to us, and we can send everything in from there. We don't have to meet you in person to get it done. Granted, the way this plan is set up, it is more of paper right now. But everything's changing with the pandemic, so we're hoping we get more access to e-sign and not have to deal with that.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Anybody else? I couldn't have covered everything. Okay. So like I said, Jen, what I'm going to do is I will send you the full recording, but then I'll also cut it so that it's just the relevant pieces that are here without some of my other diatribe that goes along with it, that makes it more relevant for somebody, the documents that are needed, how that works, and the pieces that go along with it.
Okay, great. I think that'll be helpful.
Okay. All right. So
Thanks, Tom.
anytime anybody has any questions, like I'm just gonna leave that up before I stop the share. You know, you can take the screenshot there, or like I said, Jen or Erica has our contact information, reach out to us. So we're happy to do that and anytime to answer any questions. Okay?
Thank you.
Absolutely. So, you know, if nothing else, if I don't hear from any of you, I wish you all a very, very safe, healthy, and happy holidays. And
You too.
I'm gonna end it on that.
All right. You have a
Take
good
care.
day too.